My name is Eric Rosenblum. I work in Biz Ops at Google, and it's my great pleasure to introduce my cousin, Daniel Ellsberg. And so actually at a recent Google Authors Series event, I was fortunate enough to meet Ann Farmer, who helps arrange all of these things, and she was bragging to me about what great people they get here. And she said, "You won't believe who we got coming next. We got Dan Ellsberg." I said, "You're not going to believe this, but he's my cousin. And is there any way I can introduce him?" And so I'm honored to get the opportunity. I called Dan to ask about the introduction and what I should say, and he asked what he should wear to Google. And I said, we're pretty casual. We wear jeans and T-shirts, and Kissinger and Condi Rice wore suits, so if you want to gauge where you are relative to them, that could help. He said, well, I normally wear jeans. Sometimes I'll wear a suit to speak. I always wear a suit if I think I'm going to be arrested. I think that's very important. He said, it shows that even if you're in a suit, you're not above the law. And I thought that was a very good gauge. I told him that Google is relatively safe and that we will barricade the doors if it seems like it's getting a little hairy. So a brief introduction to Daniel. Daniel was born in Detroit in 1931. He graduated from Harvard in 1952, summa cum laude in economics, and then studied for a year at King's College in Cambridge on a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship. Between 1954 and 1957, Daniel spent 3 years in the U.S. Marine Corps, serving as rifle platoon leader, operations officer, and rifle company commander. From 1957 to 1959, he was a junior fellow in the Society of Fellows at Harvard. He earned his PhD in economics at Harvard with his thesis, Risk, Ambiguity, and Decision. His research leading up to the dissertation is widely considered a landmark in the foundation of decision theory. And this was something that when I was talking to Daniel, he brought up. He said, a lot of people didn't know the Ellsberg paradox is actually named after me. They think of me as the guy for the Pentagon Papers and hadn't realized that it was the same person who earlier in his life had laid some of the foundations on behavioral economics. In 1959, he became a strategic analyst at Rand Corporation and a consultant to the Defense Department in the White House, specializing in problems of command and control of nuclear weapons, nuclear war plans, and crisis decision-making. He joined the Defense Department in 1964 as Special Assistant to Secretary of Defense John McNaughton, working on Vietnam, and transferred to the State Department in 1965 to serve 2 years at the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, evaluating pacification on the front lines. On return to the Rand Corporation in 1967, he worked on the top-secret McNamara study of U.S. decision-making in Vietnam, which later became known as the Pentagon Papers. He photocopied the 7,000 pages, and in 1971 gave it to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and 17 other newspapers. His trial on 12 felony counts, posing a possible sentence of 115 years, was dismissed in 1973 on the grounds of governmental misconduct against him, which led to the convictions of several White House aides and figured in the impeachment proceedings against President Nixon. Daniel's book, Secrets, a Memoir of Vietnam, the Pentagon Papers, reached bestseller lists. It won the Penn Center USA Award for Creative Nonfiction, the American Book Award, and the Bay Area Book Reviewers Association Prize for Nonfiction. It was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. In December 2006, he was awarded the 2006 Right Livelihood Award, known as the Alternative Nobel Prize in Stockholm, Sweden. He lives in Berkeley. They have 3 children and 5 grandchildren with his wife, Patricia Marks Ellsberg. And since the end of the Vietnam War, he's continued to be a leading voice of moral conscience, serving as a lecturer, writer, and activist on the dangers of the nuclear era, government wrongdoing, and the urgent need for patriotic whistleblowing. Before I bring on Daniel Ellsberg, I want to encourage everybody that if they have questions, please use the microphone. This is being recorded for posterity on YouTube so that people can all hear your great questions. And it's my great honor to introduce Dan Ellsberg.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm glad to say that this is still a free enough country that I don't have to anticipate being arrested for speaking at Google, and yet. That day may come, and when that day comes, I'll wear a suit. I always tell people that if you have a coat and tie when you're getting arrested, wear it when you get arrested so that other people see you, will understand that having a coat and tie do not excuse you from all the obligations of citizenship entirely. And I've been arrested probably 70 times or so, and I think always with a tie, if I could arrange it. Being back or being at this place gives me a little of the feeling of being back at the Rand Corporation, although, well, badges, didn't get signed in by guards exactly. I was a little struck that your data centers are secret locations entirely. It sounds a covert operation there that I wonder how well the secrecy can really be maintained. It would be interesting on just how it's done. I worked for the Rand Corporation about 9 years, for the Marine Corps 3 years, for the Defense Department as a consultant, partly overlapping there for a number of years, and as an employee for 2 years, and 1 year, and then the State Department for 2 years in Vietnam, then back to the Rand Corporation to work on the Pentagon Papers. And in the course of that time, I took an oath of office a number of times, not at the Rand Corporation, where I made many secrecy agreements, signed secrecy contracts. I understand that I must not tell secrets, like the location of our data center, I suppose, something like that. I don't know if you sign non-disclosure agreements here, do you at Google?
Yes.
Okay, so you can be fired, lose access, lose promotion if you maybe even be sued. For all I know, probably you could be sued as a tort, civil court, revealing certainly company secrets of some sort, and perhaps anything that you learned during this. I don't know how far it extends. I doubt if you could be put on trial as a criminal for revealing what you learned at Google, unless it were in the category of a trade secret. Am I wrong? Has anyone had that experience? Not in this audience, I mean, of course. Sometime after I had walked out of the Rand Corporation, past the guards, with a briefcase full of top secret documents, and in those days, pre-Pentagon Papers, the guards didn't examine your briefcases. I understand that to people's great frustration and irritation, that rule changed after the Pentagon Papers came out. I took out 7,000 pages of top secret documents, went to the ad office of a friend, my friend Tony Russo, who just died last week, and his then lady friend, who had an ad office with a Xerox machine, and Xeroxed these documents, and took the originals back to Rand to my safe in my office, where I had authorized access to this study, the only one at Rand, actually, with authorized access to do research on it. But I shared that with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 1969 and 70, all of it. And then when they did nothing on that, they shrank from the political risks of revealing that in hearings or without authorization from the Defense Department. I eventually gave it to the New York Times, and when they were enjoined after 2 days of publication, on their third day they were enjoined for the first time in American history from publishing. I gave it to the Washington Post, and when they were enjoined, to the Boston Globe, they were enjoined, and ultimately to 19 newspapers altogether. It was clear by that time I was underground, eluding the FBI with my wife for 13 days, so that we could put these documents out. And it was clear in the appellate courts and finally the Supreme Court that there was no way to keep newspapers from publishing these, because one after another was publishing. They stopped enjoining after 4 injunctions. As somebody said, it was like trying to capture a herd of bees. And so they couldn't, practically speaking, actually stop it. And in that context, they voted 6-3 that the injunctions themselves were unconstitutional. I think if we hadn't made enough copies to get them to the different newspapers so that they could have stopped the publication with the Times, or perhaps with the Times and the Post alone, that probably, judging from their opinions, it would have gone 5-4 or 6-3 the other way, and we would have had effective censorship at that point, prior restraint, 35 years ago or more. But as it was, they couldn't stop them. I assumed that I was breaking a law. I'd been often led to believe that these secrecy agreements I was signing were based on a law. And they said, I understand, it said that I may be prosecuted under 18 U.S.C. 793 D&E and so forth. I assumed was an applicable law. What I didn't know, so I assumed I would be prosecuted and that I would go to prison for the rest of my life. 7,000 pages, top secret. I assumed that would be a life sentence. And indeed, I was faced eventually with 15, between the two of us, 15 counts, but me, 12 felony counts with a possible sentence of 115 years. So they did have something like a life sentence in mind. And with good behavior, I'd be getting out in a third of that time this year, interestingly. Now, I didn't get that for a number of reasons, but I wanted to mention one thing here, which will be news to you, I'm pretty sure. I was just a couple of weeks ago speaking to the American Bar Association panel on this subject, to an audience much larger than this, actually, entirely of lawyers and judges. And I mentioned that my prosecution with Tony Russo was the first prosecution in the country ever of someone for a leak, for giving classified information to the press, to the public. And I asked, let me ask you, how many knew that, what I just said? Let me see. Can I see? Don't be shy. Let me put up your hand. I see one hand, really? How many did not know that? Okay, so you're awake. And some are not sure whether you knew it or not. But none of them knew it. I thought there'd be one or two judges, and none of them knew that. In other words, my prosecution was as unprecedented as the famous Supreme Court case on the injunction, which was a civil proceeding. Three other facts, which none of them knew essentially either. There's been one such prosecution since, which led to a conviction of Samuel Loring Morrison in 1984. Supreme Court refused cert in 1987. One conviction. My case was dismissed, the charges. There is one pending now against the APAC employees, Rosen and Weissman, which I'll just make a little prediction, will be dropped. I think not. But in any case, it's the third prosecution. There's been one conviction. There is a reason for that. And the reason is, again, unknown to lawyers and judges and journalists and academics on this, almost across the board, is that we don't have an Official Secrets Act. 18793 D&E, under which I was charged, and which, by the way, the APAC people are charged with, was intended for espionage. That's very clear in the legislative history of the case. In fact, the Congress at that time rejected wording from Wilson, from the administration in 1917, that would be an Official Secrets Act that criminalized any release of classified or, and they didn't have classification then, but defended, protected, guarded information from the government without authorization. Most countries have that. Britain, of course, has an Official Secrets Act. We don't because of the First Amendment. We're regarded, the public is sovereign, information is basically the property and owed to the American public and to the Congress, not the property of the government. The government can't copyright, by the way. And so although there are copyright laws, of course, civil laws, if you steal someone's book or thesis or something, and there is a criminal copyright law, but it's very narrow, we don't have a law that criminalizes the release of classified information per se. There are three small exceptions to that I can come back to later, maybe in the question period, that are relevant to pending cases, recent cases. But in general, just putting out top secret did not violate any law, which was as surprising to me as anyone else. When I assumed that they hadn't been kidding me when they kept telling you, you may be prosecuted. Well, that was right, I was prosecuted. But I was the first. No one else ever had been. And after a year of research, the case was in courts for 2 years. After a year, my lawyer, Leonard Boudin, said to me, we've done all this research, cost a lot of money, looking at unrecorded cases and looking all over the country. It appears you haven't broken any law. I was also charged with theft, conversion. In those days, pre-electronic stuff, pre the internet, theft was not involved when you copied information. you weren't depriving an owner, if there was an owner, of the use of that property. So that had never been tried before either. Again, I was charged with that. But the leading lawyer on the law of information, Melville Nimmer, had written an appellate brief for the ACLU and later an article in the Stanford Law Review, I think in '74, Melville Nimmer, the undecided issues in the Ellsberg case. And he said, by any previous interpretation of the law, Daniel Ellsberg has not violated any law, neither the Espionage Act, this is not espionage, or theft or conspiracy. So when I heard that, by the way, that is true. Okay. And somebody asked the question, I think, on your list here, since you obviously violated the law, well, what then, and so forth. I did think I was violating the law. I was deliberately doing that. But I wasn't, by any previous interpretation in this country with a First Amendment guaranteeing rights of free speech and free press. So I said to my lawyer, well, that's great, I'm home free. I said, well, Dan, it isn't as simple as that. When the government goes into court and says to a jury, United States of America versus Daniel Ellsberg and 12 felony counts, you can't be sure you'll walk out of there free. I said, well, what are my odds? I said, 50-50 of 115 years. I said, 50-50 and I haven't violated any law? He said, well, let's face it, Dan, copying 7,000 pages of top secret material and giving it to the New York Times has a bad ring to it. And now, a couple more facts finally. Congress did, in fact, finally pass an Official Secrets Act in late October, early November, two houses, 2000, in Clinton's final days after the election. Or I should say, he vetoed it after the election in November, one of his last acts. And again, I asked the judges if anybody knew that. No, nobody knew that. If such an act is passed, which will happen if there's another 9/11, the present president obviously would not veto it. I don't know about Obama, actually, but certainly Bush would not veto it. And we would have an Official Secrets Act, which would mean that in contrast to what a practice has been for the last 200 years, any time there was a leak, which is what? Every day, right? Part of every hours, every few hours on your internet. If you look at the Times or the Post or other papers, every time there's a leak, the government would have to do nothing other than call the bylined reporter into a grand jury. And now the Official Secrets Act could take two forms. It could apply only to government officials who had done the leak, or it could apply to reporters. And what's more likely is the one that they will, because of the First Amendment tradition, will at least at first stay clear of the reporter. And they will just say, a crime has been committed, clearly, which is not the case now. They've always been afraid that if they did this and the case got into the courts, the Supreme Court would find that application of the law unconstitutional. And they would no longer have it even as a threat. So they haven't had any cases, except for the three that I mentioned, one pending. But they come in now with an Official Secrets Act. They just say, if Clinton hadn't vetoed it, by the way, which was unexpected, his Attorney General had in fact supported the law, so everyone expected him to sign it without any question. But there was enough controversy at the last moment that he did veto it in the papers. And they would say to the reporter, a crime has been committed. You know who committed it. Just tell us. Reporter can't plead Fifth Amendment. There is no Shields law now, and if it were classified information, a Shield law probably wouldn't be a lot of protection the way it would be written, even if they do pass one, and I hope they do. But let's say it's something fairly sensitive, plausibly. And they say, okay, the crime has been committed, tell us who committed it. There would be no problem now finding who the leaker was, except that the reporter could refuse and go to jail, as Judith Miller did for some days, 57 days or more, and eventually did tell. Some reporters would not tell, and they would go to jail. Neil Sheehan, I'm sure, and Cy Hirsch would go to jail. others wouldn't. And with that expectation, reporters wouldn't get the leaks in the first place anymore because they could no longer provide any kind of assurance at all that they wouldn't tell. And if they did, they wouldn't print them because they'd be, so it would be government entirely by handout. And that's not a basis for democracy. There's a great range of governments in the world that have, in terms of liberality and whatnot, that have strict censorship. China, for example, we don't think of China as a free country. On the other hand, it has a lot more freedom than it did 20 years ago. And people there have their own preoccupations, and they work, and they make money, and they get married, and have celebrations, and they do all that, and they live without leaks, except for the almost entirely without leaks, and without hardly any challenge to this, except from some really courageous people who awe me by their willingness to confront that government and accept what they get, apparently time after time. But that isn't the human norm to accept that kind of treatment over and over. So China right now is not Nazi Germany, I guess, certainly in its aggressiveness and expansiveness, but it's not a democracy. England, by the way, does have an Official Secrets Act. I think this is a fair point. I need to chew more on that. They, of course, come out of an empire where they were never thought of their foreign policy or their overseas operations as being really subject to popular will, and they aren't now. And they aren't here, really, except in terms of a great deal of manipulation. Let me pass to a different side of this. Nixon's concern about me was not what I had put out about the Democrats. He was happy to get that out. As he said, if you look at my book in toward the last couple of chapters, there's stuff from Nixon tapes about his reaction to the Pentagon Papers, and where Mitchell said, well, we've got to bring a proceeding here. Mitchell wanted to bring an injunction. Nixon asked him on the tape, have we done that before? Have we done that before? He said, oh, yes, lots of times. And Mitchell was wonderful. This was sort of Gonzales-level legal advice that he was getting, and from a bond lawyer. And so this fatal action, in a way, by Mitchell. He said, but Nixon wasn't too happy even to hear that. And said, well, if we don't do this, we can't go ahead with prosecutions. He said, you mean prosecute the Times? And Ehrlichman says, yeah. Nixon says, hell, I wouldn't prosecute the Times. I'd prosecute the goddamn pricks that gave it to him. And then on the question of injunction, he said, wait a minute, couldn't we wait another day? I mean, they'll be coming out with more here. And why couldn't we wait another day? Because it was all on the Democrats. He was very happy to have that out. But then when he realized that, it was, I had information, documents from his administration, which weren't in the Pentagon Papers, which ended in 1968 before he came in. He now realized that his secret threats of escalation, including possible use of nuclear weapons against North Vietnam, for which targets had been selected, that I knew people who knew that, and I did, that they might have given me documents, which unfortunately they did not. They had not. If they had, I would not have put out the Pentagon Papers. Not a joke. I would have put those out. I wouldn't have bothered with history about other people, but about what Nixon was doing. And, but I didn't have those. However, he feared that I did. He knew that I had some on him, which I'd given to a senator who informed him. And so he had to stop me from doing that. And to do that, he took various criminal actions under the so-called plumbers, supposedly stopping leaks. And the leaks they were worried about was leaks I hadn't yet performed. So the problem was now not punishing me from a crime, but stopping me from doing something, which, by the way, was not a crime, in fact, but which did reveal aggressive and very reckless acts that he was planning and threatening, including possible nuclear war. So to do that, he sent people into my former psychoanalyst office in hopes of getting information. It's virtually always described wrongly as information with which to discredit me. Now, I was already on trial, facing 12 felony counts. kind of a badge of honor, but from some people, but it could be said to be discrediting in the eyes of some. But what he wanted was information that I didn't want out, with which he could blackmail me into silence. And in fact, they did know enough to know that a psychoanalyst probably didn't have a lot of notes or records or whatnot. They were looking just as much as anything they could get on my psychoanalyst, Dr. Lewis Fielding, to blackmail him into telling them what I'd told him, whatever it might be. Anything I didn't want revealed, something you might well reveal to a psychoanalyst, dirty dreams and that sort of thing. And they did, in fact, find stuff on Fielding. They felt he wasn't recording all of his income taxes. But for reasons I wouldn't go, and that was exactly the kind of thing they were looking for. They were as interested, we learned later from the Cubans who did this, in information on my wife and children as they were on me. I won't go into all this, but you see the web of the blackmail potential here was what they were looking for in order to manipulate, to coerce me. I think, in retrospect, there was nothing that they could have, I don't think I would have yielded to any blackmail like that. You know what the mafia does is to threaten physically your children, your relatives. And I don't know where that would be hard. I wouldn't have, I've never reflected on this even privately in public. I didn't actually think the Pentagon Papers were likely to end the war. I thought they might help. What I was doing, there was history I was doing, I thought it might help. I thought it was not much, it was a little more likely, though not that much, from what other people were doing who were going to prison to protest the war, namely draft resistance. They didn't think that by sitting on the tracks of a troop train or something, or a draft station, or refusing to send back their change of address, for which my friend Randy Keeler went to prison for 2 years. They didn't think that would end the war, and I didn't think what I was doing would end the war, but they were making as strong a statement as they could. It did affect me, so their action was not without effect, and I felt that power on my own life, so I knew the potential of that. And I thought that this truth-telling might have some effect. You can read in the book, if you do, exactly what I hoped might come of it, which didn't happen on the whole, changing people's minds about the present president. Very hard to convince people that a current president, whether they didn't, even if they didn't vote for him, is flatly lying without documentary proof. Even though I was presenting documentary proof that 4 previous presidents had lied in the same way on the same subject, I hoped they might connect that dot, or extrapolate one more and see the 5th president is also lying, as he was, and misleading you. But they didn't, on the whole. And Nixon didn't worry about it. He didn't think they would. He wanted those documents out. He wanted more out on Democrats. He wanted to go back to Yalta and Kennedy's Bay of Pigs and the assassination of Diem and anything they could get on the Democrats. And at one point they said, oh, gee, that's a big research program, you know, to go through all this stuff. And he says, I'll declassify, I'll leak out what we want. They're leaking out, we'll leak out what we want. Get the assassination of Diem, you know. So somebody said, well, this is on the tape, it's in my book. That's a big research job. You know, who can do that? And so finally Nixon says, well, you need somebody, I should quote it exactly, you need somebody who really knows the history, an intellectual who knows the history of the times, an Ellsberg who's on our side. It's neat. And I wanted to put that on the cover of my book eventually, but it was too long for the publisher. So, my favorite quote. But when it came to putting out his stuff, so that had to be stopped. So blackmail would not have done it for me, actually, and instead they were also listening to all the phone calls of their former and current National Security Council aides and a number of newsmen, and I was heard on a number of those, which when I was put on trial, we asked for any evidence of overhearing, and they said, they swore, we have none, there's been none, said the FBI. And at the end, someone leaked that there had in fact been overhearing in effect. That's, again, more of a story which you can read in the book. I don't want to go into that. But without those leaks, such as a leak of the fact that my judge was offered the head of the FBI directorship while I was on trial, secretly. No, I wasn't acquitted, but the charges were dismissed after 12 days of daily revelations of that sort, which was a wonderful, wonderful time. That was the only good time. Every day there was a new revelation. The CIA illegally had been tasked to do a psychological profile on me, so as to manipulate me, see what my vulnerabilities were. Had never been done to an American citizen and was against their charter to operate as police operation on an American citizen. They'd done it on Suharto and various Russian leaders and so forth. And then the CIA provided disguises and cameras and other equipment for the raid into my doctor's office. And then 12 former CIA assets, Bay of Pigs Cuban veterans, were brought up from Miami on illegal campaign money to incapacitate me totally, quote, to incapacitate me totally on the steps of the Capitol, giving a speech, at a point when they did think I was about to release whatever I had on Nixon, which was true, but unfortunately I didn't have all that they feared. And when they caught those people in the Watergate, and they used the same people imprudently for all these operations, they now knew a lot of other White House crimes against me that they'd done. Same people caught in the Watergate had also been at the attack on me, the abortive attack. Again, why that didn't happen is another interesting story. But at the Capitol, and then earlier had been in Fielding's office. So they had other crimes to report, to plea bargain, or just to tell the truth to a grand jury. And to keep them quiet, Nixon authorized hush money, $140,000 to Howard Hunt, former CIA. And that was a new obstruction of justice, a new crime, which eventually brought the House down. And when Nixon was faced now with possible impeachment, almost certain impeachment, for the crimes especially against me, and the reason that's the case is that the other crimes were not generally traced to him. The people who did them were in charge of them, like for him, like Mitchell and Haldeman, did not talk to the grand jury, lied, or refused to talk, and even given immunity, went to prison. And but on these, people did talk, and they pointed directly to Nixon. So he was facing prosecution beyond impeachment, and resigned, and that made the war endable. So for reasons that I hadn't foreseen, and it wasn't a direct effect, the actions that he took to keep his secrets, his wrongful secrets, from someone who was ready to put out those secrets, even at the cost of going to prison, he, in this country, had to commit crimes and cover them up. And the legal system did ultimately work and brought him down. Now, here's a change. Since 9/11, the Patriot Act legalizes most of those things against me. A sneak and peek operation into a doctor's office to get information doesn't need a warrant now. CIA can do it as an internal police agency, essentially, not just the FBI. Cooperation between the CIA and FBI, all legalized under the Patriot Act. The overhearing of warrantless wiretaps on which I was overheard. The president had simply been doing that without a law, clearly violating a law on his part, President Bush, from immediately after 9/11, if not before. There's a lot of indication he was listening to Americans from the beginning of 2001, but certainly from 2001 on. And that has just been legalized by the FISA Amendment Act. Now FISA, the one thing that hasn't been openly legalized is bringing people up to, quote, incapacitate me. But there are special forces squads working in this country, according to news stories, on anti-terrorist operations. Who's a terrorist? Who the president says it is. Someone who's opposing his policies, which I certainly am in many respects, who's getting in the way of his pursuit, as he sees it, of people he sees as terrorists, some of whom are terrorists by any definition, and I'm against all terrorism. But anybody he says, essentially, who's been supporting. So virtually all of these things then that were done against the psychological profile and so forth have been legalized. That's a change in the country, actually. We don't, as I say, yet have an official Secrets Act, but people act as if there were on the whole, but not entirely. We still do get leaks every day. That will change, can change. It's even likely to change, I would say. Certainly under McCain, I would expect that to change very soon. But and under George W. Bush, and with the consequences I've described. What difference does all this make? Well, at the end of the Constitutional Convention, proceedings which were held in secret, but we have some minutes now, by Madison and others, Benjamin Franklin was coming out of the Constitutional Convention, and at the end of it, and was asked by a woman standing there, "Well, doctor, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" And he said, "A republic, if you can keep it." Have we kept it? I would say not. And now let me say some things that are, for this audience, I won't try to hold back, provocative, if you like, things that I definitely believe, but controversial, you might say. I don't think we have a republic in the sense of a constitutional public of limited powers, checks and balances, three branches of government, separate and equal, counterbalancing government, of the kind that the founders, like Franklin and others, consciously and explicitly and carefully designed back in 1987, 1989, or the Bill of Rights. We don't have it at this moment. I don't think it's just a straw in the wind anymore. It's a cloud on the horizon. That's changed. The president has not only acted on a philosophy of government, which he holds sincerely, and in which he's confirmed by legal counselors such as David Addington, Chief of Staff of Vice President, and Bybee, who's now, he's made an appellate court judge, William Haynes of the Defense Department, John Yoo, now back at Harvard as a tall professor of law. All these people assured him immediately after 9/11, if not before, in secret legal memos, many of which are still secret, and some of which, however, have leaked out, and others have been gotten out by Freedom of Information Act or Congress, and they all have the same theme. They confirm what Richard Nixon said after he was ousted to David Frost. And he was referring to, and he was answering a question about the raid into Dr. Fielding's office, about the then crime against me. And he said, when the president does it, it's not illegal. Now, Supreme Court disagreed with that, and Congress disagreed with that. And they ousted him, basically, and he faced prosecution. This president, Cheney worked for him at the time, and Rumsfeld worked for him at the time. And they came out of that experience believing that Nixon was right or should be right, and we should have a government in which what Nixon said was the case. And that's what Bush thinks he has right now, and what these lawyers have told him in writing now, and we need more of the writing, but we've gotten quite a bit of it. I'll refer you to books by Charlie Savage of the Boston Globe, wrote a very good book. I'd have to think of some of the other names, get them on Google here fast enough. On constitutional aspects, Glenn Greenwald of Salon.com writes very well on these subjects, a lot of references there. Another very good one is Eric Lichtblau, one of the two reporters who broke the NSA story, the National Security Agency, for which the Times got a Pulitzer Prize. And I was just on a panel with Gabe Schoenfeld, before the Bar Association, with the then editor of commentary, who said the New York Times should be prosecuted for that leak. And in fact, they have a grand jury at work on the New York Times, and have had now for 3 years on that case, actually, trying to find out who the leakers were and so forth. As I say, if they wanted to bring the reporters in, which they've shrunk from doing yet, they could find out pretty quickly. But the New York Times has not yet been prosecuted for that. Okay. So what they tell him is, in these words, as you put it, YOO put it, the president cannot be constrained, not only has not been constrained, but cannot be constrained by any act of Congress from doing anything he feels necessary to protect the country as commander-in-chief of the armed forces, not of you and me, but of the armed forces, and in time of war, in this indefinite war, which we're in now. So in that quite broad area, which remember is defined by the president, this is a war, not a police action, remember that? So presidential definition. And within that pretty wide constraint, and as long as he or his successors feel appropriate, he has literally absolute powers. Now, they don't use the word absolute. I think you can't find that. What you can find is that there is no constraint that can be put on him by Congress, by the courts, by existing or future treaties, by the UN Charter, by anything. That is absolute power. And it's not an unfamiliar power. Actually, the world has been ruled by that kind of ruler, most of the world, most of the time, for recorded history. Whether you call that 3,000 years, 4,000 years, Sumer, 5,000 years. That's what rulers have claimed, earlier by divine right, and now as dictators or whatever. We had a different theory here, an invention, that we could rule without a monarch, that a country could be run without a monarch, could be self-governed without a monarch. And it was not the intention of the founders simply to have a different monarch from George III. There were those who felt that Washington could and should have been an American monarch. And Washington could have been if he'd chosen it very quickly. And to his credit, he was not of that party, that group. The majority of the founders were very clear. They did not want any monarch at all with the powers of George III or his predecessors. The powers that you, for example, incredibly, supposed scholarship that got him tenure at University of California, has written books which state that it was the intention of the founders, and he's an originalist, he's bound by the intention of the founders of the Constitution, as McCain promises to give us, people who are struck by the original meaning of the Constitution, which would, by his lights, include John Yoo, and that's not a joke. And already, well, I'll come back to it. It would cover Yoo. And Yoo says in his alleged scholarship that it was the intention of the founders to give the president the powers of the English monarch in the issues of war and peace. Now that is the opposite of the intention of the founders, as you can easily find out on Google, I'm sure, if you look into this. Of course, he was given powers as commander-in-chief to provide for civilian authority, to make that clear. Again, civilian authority, again, they had Charles I, Charles II in mind on that. I've learned from Google. I knew nothing about this. Google has given me an education on a lot of these subjects. On the specific point that the powers they now claim for the president are far beyond what even George III could claim. It's quite a good book by F.A.O. Schwartz, Jr., who was the counsel on the Church Committee, which examined the abuses of the intelligence community back in 1975, 76. And he's written a recent book called, I think, Unchecked and Unbalanced. Very good on this. And he sent me to Google, actually, talked about Charles I and Charles II. Who are these guys? And I found out. And the point being, no president, no king, since Charles I and Charles II, Charles I lost his head for it, Charles II was deposed, his son, for believing, among other things, that he could call armies into being and use them at his discretion without parliament, and in particular, that he could rescind laws, a power that kings did have. I'll decide whether this law applies or not. I'll relieve it for this person on this instance, or in general. Kings did have that, but not since the glorious revolution of 1666. So, in other words, they're claiming for him powers that George III didn't have, that had not existed for 100 years before our revolution. And when it comes to suspending habeas corpus by the ruler's action, not by Congress, that, as we've all learned, probably with the help of Google, goes back 700 years more to the Magna Carta, and even somewhat before it and somewhat after it. So ruling back, we're coming now to absolute powers like Louis XIV or various people. of monarchy that weren't even claimed by the British king that we were revolting against. The president thinks he has those powers. He asserts it. He's asserted in secret. His lawyers tell him, and Congress has not challenged him. They have not rescinded the Military Commissions Act, which essentially suspends habeas corpus, which immunizes supposedly people from torture, which is illegal domestically, internationally, in 10 different ways. Beyond the law. If he does it, it's not illegal. They mince words about what is torture and what isn't torture, as you know. But what people haven't always noticed is that, as you has pointed out to him, if the president orders it, he can order torture. Maybe waterboarding isn't torture, ha-ha. What is? Whatever it is, he can order it. And people can obey it without any challenge on that if he says it's legal. As Yu's former mentor and colleague Harold Koh, also a Korean American, interesting, dean of the Yale Law School, said these interpretations of the Constitution would enable the president to order genocide or anything, just anything. There's no limit on it. That is absolute monarchy. Okay, let's say Nixon acted on that. Johnson acted very similarly, by the way. He broke the same laws. I don't think he did think he was an absolute monarch. He came from the Senate, he took it seriously. He just knew he was breaking the law because he felt he had to, or wanted to, secretly. And he wasn't found out till long after he was in office, so the issue of impeachment didn't arise. Nixon was found out and faced impeachment. Impeachment off the table for this president who's doing everything his predecessors did in the way of crimes and more, and believes that he's entitled. And Congress, on the signing statements, which is exactly like the monarchical privilege of rescinding laws or deciding when they apply or not. I'll decide which parts of this law apply and which I'll execute and which not. That is, as I say, a monarchical privilege. So what do we have? What do we call it? It's not a republic in the sense of what the founders had in mind by republic. A monarchy, well, monarchy to most people means inherited somehow. There are occasionally in the world elected monarchs, but in terms of powers, it's an elected ruler with the powers of an absolute monarch, or in this case, an almost elected ruler. And will those powers go away? They have been ratified by Congress. They have been failed to be challenged as high crimes and misdemeanors, which they blatantly are. Anybody who faces that question, as a basis for impeachment. Prosecution, no. The hearings, they haven't even held hearings of significant. They're appeals for people to appear. They're subpoenas. Their subpoenas are ignored to this point. To the end, if they have one subpoena leading to an actual appearance, by the end of this term, it will be interesting to see. Conyers has just subpoenaed, or actually he's requested, he hasn't yet subpoenaed, he has requested a number of people to testify about the allegations of a new forgery at the orders of the White House in Ron Susskind's new book. During the vacation here, he has requested a number of people, including again Scooter Libby and others, to testify on this. We'll see what happens. I would guess nothing as far as the White House people are concerned. So they are absolutely saying, we don't share powers with you. You have no powers, no standing as far as we're concerned. Obama has not made an issue of any of these, and having said, he has said, I believe, that he would not torture, although, frankly, I have to say, Bush has said that. You know, what is torture? Bush has said, we don't torture. Like Nixon, I am not a crook. And, but there is this question, what would it mean to Obama? McCain, the man who was tortured and who really did take a stand, found himself against Cheney, not to legalize torture, refused to do it, to his credit. Then the president finally gave in, signed the bill banning torture, And a couple of days later, I think it was at their favorite time, some Friday night or something before the Saturday news cycle, non-news cycle, issued a signing statement that he would obey it to the extent he thought appropriate, nullifying it. McCain did nothing about protesting that. But worse than that, when finally the Senate spelled it out and said, okay, CIA, this applies to CIA, it applies to everybody, no torture in the broad sense spelled out in many UN and domestic laws, out. The president vetoed that, and McCain upheld the veto. Frankly, one of the worst senatorial acts of political, what should we say, cowardice, prudence, sellout, cop-out. But for McCain to do that with his background and his standing, really bad, really bad. And not to single him out, I personally think it was really bad for former Lieutenant John Kerry to have voted for the Iraq War. I believe he knew much better than that. But he was going to run for president, and he should not have voted for that war. Absolutely. Let's put aside Lieberman or whoever else. But John Kerry should not have voted for that, and McCain should not have voted for torture. And to uphold that. Okay. A government, by the way, again, that can just at the discretion of the president keep anybody in lockout indefinitely as an enemy combatant, including American citizens, it's not done, without charges, meaning forever, no trial, no judge, no adversarial hearings in Congress. That's actually not a democracy. And when anybody is subject to being tortured during that, as they really are, again, the relation of the government to the people is not what we think of as a democracy. So what will we be voting for? Obama himself had said that he would filibuster any act that provided for immunity from civil suit for overhearing for the telephone companies who had helped the government from early 2001, not just 9/11, listen in on American citizens, something which Quest Communications refused to do because they said it was blatantly illegal and suffered in corporate terms for that. But the other companies went along. The only way of finding out what they were actually listening to, who were they listening to, why, what use was being made, was civil suits. That was clear. The government was totally stonewalling on this issue. Arlen Specter, the Republican former prosecutor, senator, head of the Judiciary Committee, when the Republicans were in control, said, "It's blatantly unconstitutional, blatantly illegal, and I can't find out what NSA is doing." And he says that to this day, now that he's in the minority. Cannot know entirely what NSA is doing in Congress. Civil suits were not a sure way of finding out, but they were the best way available. So Obama, along with others, said, with Chris Dodd and Feingold, said, "I will filibuster any legislation that provides for immunity and thus prevents discovery in a civil suit." And in the course of running for president a month ago, I think it was June 9th, it was around that period, Obama not only voted for closure, he not only didn't join the filibuster of Dodd and Feingold, he voted for closure that would stop any filibuster, and he voted for the bill that included immunity. Again, not good. Really bad. That bill, in effect, saying that Nixon was right, that just by saying to any corporation or any person, if I authorize you to do it, it's legal. I'll make that more specific. If I tell you it's legal on the advice of you, Addington, Bybee, Gonzalez, these people, Ashcroft, or the people he's put on the bench, Alito, Roberts, they all believe in this unitary executive, absolute monarchical power. We have 2 judges now who made it clear in their confirmation hearings that they believed that the president had no restraint on him, and yet they were confirmed with many Democratic votes. The failure to filibuster, in particular Alito, was very clear on this, I would say was a violation of the oath of office of every senator who failed to filibuster. and that's all of them. Now, the oath of office is the same one I took in the Marine Corps as a second lieutenant, as a first lieutenant, later in the Defense Department, a GS-18, highest civil service grade. State Department, Foreign Service Reserve Officer 1 when I went to Vietnam. It's the same oath that every member of Congress takes, and every official in the government, and any officer in the government take the same words. And it is an oath, unlike the secrecy agreements, for which is a contract which you've signed, of the kind you've signed. I doubt if you raised your hand and said, I swear to so help me God, I will never reveal secrets of the Ghoul. Did you? Tell me if I'm wrong. Yes? Maybe you don't swear to God, but you swear to somebody? Who's the founder? You don't have a Bill Gates, if there is a Bill Gates. At Microsoft, they do that. I swear to Bill Gates, so help me. But the oath is not to the president. President isn't mentioned. It's not to the commander-in-chief. It isn't even for officers in the U.S. Army and Marines. It's not to the secrecy system. It's not to a Führer. The oath is to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That's it. There's a little more words just about how seriously you take this and so forth. That's the substance. Now, when I knew that my boss, Secretary McNamara, and Johnson were lying us into war, and you can read that in the first chapter of my book, which I put on the web, by the way, when it came out, as it hit the stands, because it was so relevant to what was happening in 2002 as we were being lied into Iraq, that I wanted to put it on the web. I would have put the whole book on, and I wanted at least to put several chapters on. So my editor came back and said, no, it isn't even in the stores yet. We can't put several chapters on. You can put one in. So I put one in, first chapter about Tonkin Gulf, and I won't go through that now. But when I knew that they were lying about every aspect of that, as in Iraq, as on Iran now, essentially, I thought that might make people see something of an analogy. When I kept my mouth shut to Congress about that, I was not upholding my oath to support and defend the Constitution. The Constitution was being flaunted, clearly. All the people who knew of the NSA illegal wiretapping for the last 7 years on November 12th were violating the oath that they all took. There aren't many ways you can violate an oath to uphold the Constitution. I mean, not everything raises a constitutional issue, but some things are pretty blatant. And clear-cut criminal violations by your bosses who have sworn to their duties to uphold the law are clearly in that category. The Congress people, the ones, as I said, who did not vote to deny Alito impeachment with his monarchical powers. That's where we are now with all this violation going on. You have essentially ratification by Congress of a different form of government. I would say monarchy, despite the inherited aspect implication, is a pretty good description, dictatorship of a kind. Obviously, we have a ways to go. It can get a lot worse. Obviously, kings, vary in their benevolence or their liberality or whatever. And as I say, I'm here now, right now, and I can still fly even. For who knows, I'm not on a no-fly list yet. So we have a ways to go, and I think we'll go there unless there's a lot more resistance than we've ever seen yet, and a lot more courage and a lot more upholding of oaths by people in the government. In November, people will not be choosing between two candidates for a presidency in the meaning of the Constitution. They will not be offered that choice. They will be selecting candidates for monarchical power. They will be choosing for different kings, unless, and one of them may choose to give up some of those powers. And I don't think it'll be McCain. I hope it'll be Obama, but I don't count on that, by the way. I don't know any president who's really forsworn powers that have been bequeathed to him. I'll end with this thought. Just sitting back there with a Google in my lap, I looked up America, and I think there was 900 million entries. And the reason, I looked up Republic, there were about 365 million entries. And by the way, the first entry on America, United States of America, was a Wikipedia thing, and it said, the first sentence of that, a constitutional republic. Well, that's relevant to the reason I looked it up, because I had looked up in Google a phrase that was ringing in my head from Langston Hughes, the black poet of the 30s. I remembered the phrase, let America be America again. Oh, let America be America again. And wonders of Google, came right out, got out there. And I remembered the refrain, which is in there, America never was America to me, the black man in the 30s. But he says, oh, let America be America again, the land that never was and yet must be. Oh, yes, I say it plain. America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America must be. This world needs America in the sense that Langston Hughes was thinking. And that doesn't just pop out at you if you Google it. Of those 900 million entries, you won't find a quick answer to the question, what is the America he was hoping for and swearing that he would help get? But I think I've told you about some of the aspects of it, some things we've lost. I am extremely unhappy that when I next pledge allegiance, it will be to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stood. But that is the republic to which I have pledged my allegiance. I didn't always obey that oath, but I'm going to for the rest of my life, and I have been for a while. And it's all up to us, it's all up to you to do that, to define for yourself. And if you find that you define it the way you and Addison and Addington and other people do it, that's your right as an American. It's not your right if you take an oath as they did to uphold the Constitution as it was written. They should be prosecuted for that, not just impeached and prosecuted and convicted, I would say, and the president and Cheney with them. But as an opinion, if you feel that the dangerous world of after 9/11 requires a monarch, and many Americans do, maybe the majority, then you've got no problem. No. But as you can also find very quickly, I'm sure, on Google, as John Adams said, after he got out, at the time of the revolution, only a third of the colonists thought there should be a revolution or independence. A third were loyal to the king, to the empire, and a third were indifferent. He said in some areas like New York, where the British made their headquarters, a half supported the empire. That means that 2/3 were quite happy to live under a king. Here's my guess. That's always been true, and it's true right now. And if I say, and if I convince you, our friends, we have a king right now, and we're electing a king in November, and you spell out what that means, let me make a guess that most Americans can live with that. All right. But there really are dangers to it. There really are costs. It was worth those people who pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to change that, to live without a king. And that's the way I hope a number of us will continue to do. Thank you.